One. Well, hello and welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast, where we talk with writers from all mediums and genres about themselves, their work, and advice they have for writers. I'm your host, Paul Zeidman, and I'm quite happy today to be talking to my guest, Sean McLachlan. And this is what his bio says: a freelance writer specializing in fiction, history, and travel. Sean is the author of numerous books, including the Toxic World post-apocalyptic series and the Trench Raiders World War I action series. Sean, welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And as readers, oh man, I'm so out of it today. As listeners and viewers are familiar, we'd like to start things off talking about things we may have read or watched lately. I'll go first just to give Sean some time to gather his thoughts. I watched Big Trouble in Little China. I've seen it many,
Oh,
many times before.
classic.
Yeah, because I just finished listening to the 5 Minutes of Trouble podcast, where it's part of the Movies by Minute series where they discuss a movie a minute at a time, but for some reason they did this one 5 minutes at a time, so which really drastically reduced the number of episodes. But I like to, when I finish the all of the episodes that they do, I go back and watch the movie again because I have the influence of what they were talking about. It's a lot of behind the scenes stuff and watching it, and it's still fun. I've enjoyed that one since it ever came out back in the 80s. Just Kurt Russell, perfect as Jack Burton. I just think it's a fun movie, and you can't go wrong with watching that one. And also this weekend, I saw it yesterday. No, Saturday. I saw Deadpool and Wolverine. I liked it. I didn't love it. I'd probably give it maybe like an 8.5 out of 10. I thought the villain was a little weak and it could have been a little shorter, but overall, I did enjoy it a lot, and I'm glad I saw it. And so I'll toss it over to Sean.
Great.
What have you been up to?
I write a lot of historical fiction, and including a lot of historical mystery. And one series I've been liking a lot lately is S.G. McLean's The Seeker series. And The Seeker is the code name for this detective in Old England, Old London, in the 1500s, or 1600s, I should say, who is basically the spy master for Oliver Cromwell. The English Civil War
Hmm.
is over, Oliver Cromwell has taken over, but there's still a lot of people who are against him, and he's stopping assassination attempts and sneaking around London, and it's all very nefarious and backbiting. And London is drawn very well. S.G. McLean has a advanced degree in history, and her writing shows it. And what I really like about it is that coffee, which is dear to many a writer's heart, I was just making a big splash in England at the time. They were starting imports. And so there's a coffee house that's the center of a lot of the action. And coffee houses were just becoming a big cultural phenomenon there. And she draws that
Wow.
very well. So everyone's going there and reading newspapers and gossiping and arguing politics and trying not to get in trouble with Cromwell's spies when they argue about politics a little too much. And so the seeker is always going to the coffee house to find out more. So it's very well drawn, and it really takes you into that period, which is, I think, the essential part of any historical novel.
No, I'm sorry. What was the time frame? You say the
The
1600s?
series is called The Seeker,
Hmm.
and the first book is called The Seeker, and it's by S.G. McLean,
Hmm.
Mclean, close to my name, but not exactly. Yeah, great series if you like historical mystery.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that is something I want to get into a little bit when we get to talking about your work. But let's talk about you a little bit. I mean, how did you get your start? Were you always a writer? I mean, I know that part of your bio was that you were an archaeologist first, and then
Yeah, yeah, I
then you
was
like transitioned to writing.
Yeah, that was kind of strange. Well, what happened was I was an archaeologist for 10 years. I got a master's degree. I worked in all over the Middle East and Eastern Europe and parts of the United States as well. But I realized that academia wasn't really for me. And if you really want to make a career as a archaeologist, you really need to get a PhD and go into some academic department somewhere. And I found that a bit too constraining. And I'd always liked writing. I'd done a lot of sort of smaller pieces during the zine movement of the 90s. I started doing some travel writing when I was an archaeologist because those two dovetailed quite nicely. And I slowly made a transition. I was a journalist for a while. I worked for Reuters and the New Delhi Bureau for a bit, and worked for a couple of local newspapers, and then slowly got into freelance. And that was 25 years ago. And I've been hopping around ever since. If you want to have a long-term career as a writer, your emphasis will shift fairly regularly. I did a lot of guidebooks and military history books for a while. I did a lot of freelance magazine until that started to dry up. I worked for Gadling, which was a big travel blog for AOL,
Mhm.
back when you could make a living as a blogger. Very few people are doing that these days. And then I shifted into full-time indie fiction. I do ghostwriting as a side project and also books under my own name.
Okay, that's fascinating. Okay, so I have to do a quick side route here. So as soon as, most people these days, as soon as they hear archaeologist, they think Indiana Jones. And
Mm.
so, and the thing is that I've heard this more than a few times, that a lot of people say Indiana Jones is actually a terrible archaeologist because he just goes right in and he just like,
Yes.
tromps all over a
Not
site.
very much scientific method with that guy.
Exactly. And he just
We're all fans anyway.
yeah, exactly. And so like I'm sure people say, "Oh, you got a whip too." And so
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean I just like it's fascinating to hear like someone who's actually in the field discuss like a very
Mm.
popular fictional character based in that field. I mean, what is your take on the character apart from the, punching Nazis part?
Well, I mean, he's obviously fictitious, and I don't think most people in the public really think archaeologists are like that because it's so over the top. I think he could be a little more careful with the artifacts he
Mm.
handles, but whatever. It's okay. And it does actually get people interested in archaeology. I think
Yeah.
it probably does get people reading more and going to museums more and that sort of thing. Now, if you're going to ask me my opinion about the Ancient Aliens shows, that's going to be a
Okay,
little
yeah, we're not gonna
different.
we're not gonna get into that one. Yeah, because I actually have heard a lot of people say like, oh, I grew up watching the Indiana Jones movies that made me like want to pursue a career in archaeology.
Mm,
So I think that's fascinating to hear the influence that this character has had and just the ramifications of all the things that he's
yeah.
done and that are portrayed. It's great to see that it has that kind of
Yeah.
influence.
What got me into archaeology actually was as a kid growing up in Toronto, in Canada, the Royal Ontario Museum had an excellent Egyptology section,
Hmm.
and they had a mummy there who was unwrapped down to the chest. So you just see his head like,
Oh,
and they had put his case at kid level. So
oh
you'd walk
wow,
up, and 8-year-old me would walk up, and I'd be inches away, level with the face of this ancient
oh
mummy.
wow.
And it freaked me out every time I went, but I had to go see it.
And then it just compelled you to know more about
Yeah.
about the era and there's just about like all the details involved.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I started reading, and, I got more serious, obviously, when I got older. And
Sure.
yeah, and I don't regret my time as an archaeologist. I learned a lot, and it gets into my books quite a lot too,
Okay.
because I have a series set in Egypt. So,
Sure. Sure. Actually, that is one of the things I wanted to ask you about. So you've worked in so many genres. I mean, historical mystery, science fiction, and action adventure. I mean, so when you started, did you think like I'm going to write about about this era or this time period or this time in history and did you just think okay then the more you wrote the more you realize oh actually I could do a story about this time and it was just like then you're all over the place.
well, when I started, I have to admit I was a bit unfocused. I was trying everything,
Okay.
um, which is considered the wrong way to do it. But I don't regret that either because I was feeling my way out, and so I tried action adventure stuff. I wrote a western. I did a, a post-apocalyptic series that did well until it didn't, because series will often just sort of fall off after a
Okay.
while. And really found my current home in historical mystery. So I've written 3 series, 2 of which are continuing. Actually, I just started a 4th series. So the historical mystery is where I'm feeling comfortable right now. And it gets me to do a lot of the historical research I love and travel to the places where I write about. And it's my main focus right now.
Okay, yeah, that is one of the things I did notice that, I mean, you've got stories set World War One and World War Two and post-war, one set in the American Civil War and the 18th century.
Mm.
Is there any of those that you particularly enjoy, or just kind of like, oh, I like them all, and I just want to, I
Well,
have stories to tell?
I seem to have settled a lot on the interwar period between World War I and World War II.
Hmm.
because there's just so much happening and so much changing, and we all know what's coming, but the characters don't. So that
Mm,
makes it interesting.
okay.
For example, my Egypt series is set in 1919. One of the characters is a World War I veteran who's scarred literally and emotionally, and he leaves Europe vowing never to go back and settles in Cairo and opens an antique shop. And of course, people start getting murdered around him. But also, it's the same year that the Egyptian independence movement kicks off.
Mm,
So I can have that as a background and talk about that a little bit. And one of the other major characters is Sudanese and also wants the country to become independent. And then there's a third character, an Egyptian street boy, who is just worried about surviving and doesn't care about politics at all. And so you get all these different perspectives on the same historical movement, which is a lot of fun. And then my Weimar series set in Berlin in the Roaring Twenties, which is a lot of
mhm.
fun because things got a bit crazy there as far as nightlife went. But everybody knows, all the readers know, it's within 3 years of the setting of the story, all of that's going to end.
Right.
But all the characters have no idea.
Sure, sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one of the things you mentioned earlier was that about doing research, and I mean, I know you've traveled a lot for your work, but I guess that especially when you're doing stories that are set in foreign locales, that does it help the 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 details of the story, but also influences, I guess, influences the characters to go to that location and kind of
Oh
like do
yes,
research about the
definitely,
history.
definitely. Um, with any book set in a foreign or let's say exotic locale, the reader wants to be taken on a trip.
Hmm.
And if you can tell them what the muezzin's call sounds like, or the smells of the spices in the market smell like, they love it. And the only way you can really get that is to go to the places. So I always try to go to the places where I write about. My Tangier series, I go to Tangier regularly. My Cairo series, I'm 2 months a year in Cairo. I broke my rule for the sixth book, the one that's in edits right now for my Cairo series, because it's set in the Sudan, but I
Okay.
can't go to the Sudan because of the civil war.
Hmm.
But it's set in the Nubian villages, and because there's Nubian villages in southern Egypt, I went to those instead. So they had to be a stand-in, close enough. Hopefully my
Okay.
readers will forgive me because I'm not going to dodge bullets for them. So, but no, it's a lot of fun, and it's also got the plus of being a tax write-off.
Okay.
And so and it really helps with inspiration. If you can't get inspired while sitting in the old city of Cairo, then there's something wrong with you.
Okay. I was going to say that do you ever, while you're doing your research, does that have more of an influence? Maybe like you discover something and realize, oh, this would be a great detail for this story, and then maybe that that's that suddenly your whole
Oh yeah,
story has changed.
it does happen. Yeah. You often pick up little snippets. There was a detail. Well, I can't really give it away, but there's a detail, the decoration of one of the most famous mosques in Cairo that I realized would make a wonderful clue to book one
Oh,
of my series. So I wrote it in, and I didn't have that before. And then because I sort of think I needed to get the characters from this point of knowledge to this point of knowledge, and I don't have a connector. And then I was like, I saw that, I was like, oh wait, that's perfect. So the setting will give you information like
hmm.
that. And people you see, people you meet, things you hear, that all fills in. It's inspiration made easy.
Well, that's great. So, is there such a thing as too much research that you like have all this information, like you want to put
Yeah,
it in the story and realize actually I don't need that. You're weighing things down.
that is a problem. I mean, you have to self-edit a bit, and
Hmm.
your beta readers will tell you if you start lecturing.
Oh,
But
okay.
with experience, you get to the balance. Some of my earlier books, my beta readers and my editors were like, "Come on, you need to trim this down a bit." But you get to a point where you know where you're no longer taking them on a journey, but taking them through a lecture, and you have to cut down.
Sure, sure. So when you like maybe discover, as you just mentioned, you discover like this new detail that you can put into the story. I mean, is it a combination of, oh, this is great, like, oh man, I have to go back and rewrite, chapters 3 through 8, type of thing. Just
It's usually nothing that major, luckily.
okay.
But because the basis of the plot no matter what the genre is, people are reading because they want stories about people. And it doesn't matter if they're solving mysteries or in a spaceship or in a Western ranch or a saloon or something. That doesn't matter. They want
Hmm.
stories about people. So the basis of me figuring out what I want to do with the story is figuring out what happens with the people. And I usually am starting with the main character or characters in a certain situation, certain relationship with one another. And I figure out how I want it to change by the end of the novel, and then I write to that.
Hmm. Okay, so that is what I wanted to ask you. Like, what's your process for putting a story together? Do you come up with the idea first, or maybe there's some kind of inspiration, like, oh, hey, what if, such and such found, fill in the blank, and then after you come up with the idea, what is the process? I mean, do you kind of like, okay, here's the scenario, or like, I've got all this research that I can apply to this. I mean, how does Sean put a story together?
Well, the first thing that comes is the characters usually,
Okay.
definitely, and then the setting comes almost immediately thereafter, and then I figure out what the initial problem is for the character and then where they need to go. Like with Catherine Schmidt, my character in my Weimar series, i wanted I wanted her to be in Weimar Germany, but I didn't want her to be German,
Okay.
because I wanted that sort of outsider view. But I decided that would be too much of an outsider view. So I figured, okay, she's German American, because I used to live in Missouri and there was all these German American communities there, which until World War One used German as their native language and had classes in their local schools in German. And so they were fluent in German until they started getting persecuted during World War One. There were riots and there were laws against using their language. So Catherine grows up fluent in German, but also being somewhat persecuted for being German. So she goes to Germany and she's able to speak to everyone, but she doesn't know a lot of things about German life because she's never been there. So people are explaining things to her and therefore to the reader.
Of
So
course.
that's sort of a good, and because she's seen riots and persecution of certain ethnic groups, she knows a bully when she sees one. So she's
Hmm.
not very happy about the rising Nazi party.
Okay, so what has the reaction been to, I guess, these kinds of stories? I mean, do you get readers who are familiar, but also readers who are not familiar with the material? So, like, maybe you have someone who like all of this is brand new, or do you say like, oh, you're my friend who's an expert in Egyptology. What do you think of this series? I mean, what
Well,
this what?
you get a range,
Okay,
and the most comments I've gotten has been for my Egypt series,
okay.
and a lot of people will have a passing knowledge of Egyptology. They don't know about basic things about the mythology and that sort of thing. They tend not to know anything about the independence movement, and they know enough to appreciate it, and they also like learning. But of course, you will always, anytime you display you talk about historical period, you will always get criticisms, and that's okay. Because I get comments in the review section saying I'm too hard on the British Empire, and other people say I'm too easy on the British Empire. Um, what can you do?
Well, I wanted to ask, do people put like a modern filter on the material? Do they say, oh, no, oh, that they would never say that sort of thing, or oh, that's too far-fetched an idea.
Sometimes, yeah, yeah. It, his history is always tricky because it's always a battleground, and some people will react negatively if they're reading something that's not their version of history.
Hmm.
But I do my research, and I write it the way I see it. And the thing is that I'm also writing from several points of view, so that changes things. If you have an Englishman who's rejected his home country because of what it's done to him is going
Hmm.
to have a certain point of view that's very different from a Sudanese member of the independence movement, which is going to be very different from an uneducated, unlettered Egyptian street boy. And that's something I really like exploring in fiction is every situation has all these different points of view. Like if you walk down the street, you're going to see it through the filter of your background. You're going to see it as a writer or as a screenwriter, because you're a screenwriter. A police officer is going to see the street very differently. A homeless person is going to see the place very differently. A woman, especially at night, is going to definitely see the street very differently. And it's the same street. And that's what's fascinating about writing, is you can get all these different points of view and see how reality is actually very dependent on who's looking at it.
Oh,
And that's a
yeah,
lot.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, so of all of the genres that you work in, I mean, because you were talking about historical mystery and science fiction and action adventure, is there one that you originally started on and you kind of like, it's, this, I like this, but then maybe you discovered, oh, actually, no, I like the historical mysteries more. Or was it kind
Well,
of like, or were we just
like
kind of
the
like
Trench
bouncing
Raider
around?
series was fun, but it was a bit I was sort of imitating the old 70s men's adventure books, like all
Okay,
those World War II novels, except to put it in World War I, which is of course less popular.
sure.
Good marketing, Sean. And I just found it more interesting. And so it didn't really catch on like I hoped it would be. When I found historical mystery, that worked much better because it was the history stuff I loved, and I enjoy mysteries, and it's also a more popular genre, and it's something that could get some momentum behind it.
Okay, I was going to say when you put the mystery aspect to it, this is something I've always wanted to. I like asking mystery writers. So when you have the overall mystery, how do you put that together? Do you start with what the answer is and then work your way backwards and try to
Well,
figure out how can
yeah,
I
it's
connect it together?
I can't remember her name, but some old school mystery writer, it might have been Dorothy Sayers, said that when you're writing a mystery novel, you're actually writing two novels. You're writing the novel of the criminals, and then you're writing the novel of the investigator.
Hmm.
And every now and then does the novel of the criminals come up and touch the surface of where the investigator is. And the investigator is trying to discover this novel down here. So you have to figure out what the criminals did, why they did it, how they did it, and where they messed up, so that the investigator can detect them. And
Okay, okay, yeah,
so,
please go
so
ahead.
that makes it a little more difficult than other fiction.
Okay, so when you're writing, especially a mystery, did you have you ever come upon maybe a story detail that there's no answer for? Because it just made me think of, I think it's The Big Sleep, and it was I think Raymond Chandler, that someone said, how did this character, like, who killed him, and he realized, I don't know, and they never answer it.
I've had a few mysteries that I've read that had glaring question marks in them. I won't call anybody out, but yeah, every now and then you get a mystery where you're left with loose ends, and I try to avoid that. Hopefully, I have.
I
Nobody's
was
called
going to
me.
say, have any of your readers pointed that out, or do you try to take
No,
care
no,
of it? Or
nobody's
you?
called me out on that yet. So they say I'm a bit over the top sometimes. One reader, this was meant as a compliment, but some people wouldn't consider it a compliment, called my Egyptology series, if Agatha Christie and Indiana Jones had a love child,
Okay,
which is
I can see
not
that
to
one.
everybody's taste, but
Sure, sure. So one of the things that we really didn't touch on much is that you've also worked in science fiction.
yes.
So I mean, what were some of the influences for that? And because it sounds like you're doing more of the historical mysteries now.
Yeah.
I mean, was science fiction, you like, I want to give it a try, and you just kind of like, actually, I think I like the mysteries more.
Well, I've always been a big science fiction fan,
Okay.
and I wanted to try a series. It's interesting how the Toxic World started. I was working for Gatling at the time, and I was not really speeding up my own fiction writing as much as I wanted to. And I lost my job. Actually, everybody lost their job. Gatling went out of business, and
Okay.
we all learned. We knew there was trouble, so we were all kind of making Plan Bs, and it collapsed, and we all lost our jobs, which was sad but not surprising. And then it was just at the end of October of 20, I can't remember what year it is now, what year it was then, but it was just the next day was National Novel Writing Month. And I
Oh,
already had
wow.
an idea for the first book in Toxic World, Radio Hope. And so I just dove into it. I was newly unemployed, And I wrote an 85,000 word novel in 1 month because I
Wow.
had nothing else to do. And I was really panicked about my future. And then, of course, I went back and did lots of edits. But that taught me that you can write well and write quickly if you have enough focus, because a book doesn't take a certain amount of time, it takes a certain amount of effort. And if you can compress that effort into a shorter period of time, you can write more books.
Okay, yeah, so that is one of the things I also wanted to ask you about. So I found on your website that you also wrote the book Writing Secrets of the World's Most Prolific Authors. And so what was the inspiration for this?
Well, that was originally a research project for myself
Hmm.
to discover how these prolific authors wrote so many books. And I decided that the cutoff point was to make it into my book, you had to have published at least 300 books. Most of them were novelists, but there were also history books and biographies and that sort of thing in there. Isaac Asimov is the least productive writer I have in that book. And
Oh,
just imagine how much he's done. Yes, he barely made the cut, actually. And what I did is I chose writers who were dead, so I could look at their career in full, who worked in the 20th century, so the market was roughly what we're dealing with now, although there have been a lot of changes,
hmm.
and who had written at least 300 novels. And I and had written about their process, so I could see what was in common between them all. And I found many things in common. One of them was well, a lot of work ethic. One was that they would always work on different projects at the same time, which is something I immediately took on. For example, today I was working on book 3 of my Weimar series, but I was also working on a spy thriller for a ghostwriting client. And I'm also working on my newsletter that comes out on the 16th of every month. So having different projects at the same time really helps, because as several of these prolific authors explained, if you have to think something through in project A, well, you just go to project B, work on that. So you're always getting forward momentum. And after you've worked on project B for a while, or maybe hop to project C, then the solution for project A will come up, and it'll keep you from staring at a blank screen.
Hmm.
So I always have 2 or 3 projects open on my screen.
Yeah, I was going to say, I really like how the description of the book says to show how anyone with the right mindset can massively increase their word count without sacrificing quality. And I think for me, it's using the word mindset.
Yes.
It's more effective than saying, okay, here's what you need to do. It's kind of
Yeah.
like, here's how you have to approach it. And it sounds like you were not only able to apply that to your own work, but you're kind of like, I don't want to say instructing the reader, but it's kind of like, okay, here's a helpful hint that will help you, and rather than just like, okay, you need to do steps A, B, and C.
Oh yeah, it helped my word count a lot. I averaged 3,000 words a day. So, and with fairly clean copy. I mean, it obviously has to be edited, but
Sure.
I try to keep fairly clean copy. And if you include my ghostwriting books, I'm at, I believe, 108 books now.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, I've been doing this for 25 years. It adds up.
Hmm. Yeah, I was going to say, especially about when it comes to the multiple projects at the same time, that for a lot of people that sounds really tough because it's kind of like, oh, I need to focus on this one thing that I'm doing now, and if I go and, and work on something else, then the first thing is going to it's going to fall by the wayside. So, is there a way that a writer can just kind of, I guess, keep their multitasking healthy?
Well, don't overwork yourself. That's another bit of advice.
Okay.
Know when to stop. I put a goal of 3,000 words a day, which I find is very productive in the long term. That adds up to 1 million words a year. And it also gives me a good work-life balance. I can get done and have time for my friends and family and my hobbies, and reading for pleasure or reading for research. I mean, it is an 8-hour day, 7 days a week, but it provides me with a good living. But you do need to watch it with your projects. Sometimes if you leave a project for too long because you get focused on a couple of others, then it's harder to start up. I had
Mm.
that this last week because I was finishing up book 6 of my Cairo series. And I was finishing up something for a ghostwriting client. And now I'm on a new book for a ghostwriting client. And then I just got back to Catherine in Berlin in 1930 and realized I hadn't worked on this one for since last October. I'm like, oops. So it took a
Wow.
while. So I had to read through what I had gone through. Luckily, there was only a few chapters so far, and then I got back into it. But it took a bit of time. So you have to be careful you don't leave things too long.
So is it kind of like maybe you have like a daily checklist, like okay, I'm going to work on project A from like
Yeah.
from 8 a.m. until 10, and then take a little coffee break, and then 11 to 1 I'll work on project B. Is it that sort of thing, or is it kind
Well,
of like you
scheduling
have
works
to?
well for some people, but for
Sure.
me, I just have basically a to-do list and give
Hmm.
myself as much time as I need to do that list. Like my to-do list today was 2,000 words for my ghostwriting client, 1,000 words for my own book, this interview. I have to tweak my Facebook ads, and I have to write a short piece for a hobby newsletter that I'm part of. So I had a little extra work today, but it's just how I find for myself having a to-do list works. And here's a silly little psychological trick because you always get a dopamine hit when you cross something off a
Oh
to-do
yeah.
list because it's an
Hmm.
accomplishment. If I discover something that I need to do and then I do it that wasn't on my list, I write it on my list and then cross it off, which is ridiculous, but it actually works. You actually still get the dopamine hit.
Well, no, I think that's even more effective because it's like, hey, there's this other thing that I was going to do and I did it, and so now it's an
Yeah.
additional
Yeah.
crossed off my list type of thing.
Yeah. And try not to have a to-do list that's too long. Have a
Mm.
to-do list that you can get through, or at least mostly get through every day. Make it ambitious, but not insurmountable, because that gets depressing.
Yeah,
At
I was
the
going to say like maybe set realistic goals, not like
yeah,
not like, I'm gonna write 3 chapters of my book today. More like, hey, I'll as you said, maybe it's about word count.
yeah, and be flexible too. If you want to get 2,000 done in project A and 1,000 in project B, but you kind of need to think something through, then do more in project B. I firmly believe there's no such thing as writer's block. What I do think is that you occasionally have to think things through,
Hmm.
and that's not the same thing. You just have to work on it a bit. I think writer's block is mainly an excuse. Either somebody just doesn't want to write, or they can't be bothered. If there's no other career, like Isaac Asimov always said that his dad was a shop owner and he never got shopkeeper's block. He would go open his shop whether he wanted to or not. And what I've noticed, and I've had a lot of colleagues say the same thing, is that sometimes you just don't feel like it, but you need to. And you get into it and you write, and then you look back and you can't tell which chapters were written on days that you didn't want to and which chapters were written on days that you did, because the
Yeah.
quality is still there. It might take longer that day. In fact, it
Hmm.
usually does, but you can still get it done.
Oh yeah, I can totally relate to that because like from when I'm working on screenplays, that my daily goals I try to write at least 3 pages,
Mm.
and but I mean I outline like crazy before I get to pages, but if I can get 3 pages done in a day, I'm happy. Anything more than that is a bonus. But there are also days I might only be able to do two, or I'll be
Mm.
like two that and then I have to go back and because I'm not happy with them, and I'll be upset or I'll be frustrated, but I'll also realize, well, it's still two more than I had than when the day started. So I
Yeah.
think
Oh,
I
yeah.
think it's that whole psychological thing that you can't beat yourself up because you didn't hit your goal,
No.
but you also have to be fair with yourself. Realize, okay, you're setting realistic goals. You're not being unrealistic about it.
Yeah. And also you're in for the long haul. I mean, I'm about to turn 55. One of my favorite writers, Ursula Le Guin, died at age 88, halfway through her latest work. So I got plenty of time. And you had a guest on who's writing at 101.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a hard act to follow. I got to tell you,
Well, I
that
and
was
well,
impressive.
well, and if I could remember correctly, she started as a journalist, and that was in the '60s, and I think she
Wow.
was 40 in her 40s then,
Oh
and
wow.
then and she's been steadily writing, but I also don't think she works those 8 hour days. It's I think it's a
Fair
little
enough.
somewhat lighter load for
Fair
her.
enough. It reminds me a bit of Ursula Bloom, who's another person in my writing secrets of the world's most prolific authors. And she got her start in around the turn of the century in England, writing for women's magazines, because that's the only thing women could write for back then.
Sure.
And then she started getting into novels, but she really liked journalism. So she started expanding out into doing more types of journalism. What she really wanted to be was a crime writer, but they wouldn't let her because she was a woman. Women couldn't be crime writers back in the 19 teens.
Hmm.
So she had a long career, and about 40 years later, after writing all sorts of best-selling novels and all this journalism and thousands of short stories, she basically demanded to one of her papers, I'm going to be a crime writer now, or you're going to lose me. And so she finally got to be a crime writer later in life. And she was one of the first female crime writers, crime journalists in England.
Wow. Okay. Because when you were, I'm glad you specified that at the end because you said crime writers. I was thinking, well, you
No,
mean
I
like,
meant like crime journalists
okay, so covering
covering
crimes.
crime. Yeah, yeah,
Okay. I was going to say if she wanted to be a crime writer, just, use a nom de plume and,
yeah. Mm.
or just go by her initials. So what would you say, uh, what would be a key piece of advice that you would give to writers? I mean, I guess because you've worked in so many genres that and also so many different areas that is there something like one key piece of advice or maybe like a couple of suggestions like here's if you want to be a good writer or you want to be a prolific writer, what would a writer need to do?
Well, I'll give a couple pieces of advice.
Okay.
For beginning writers, I'll give the best piece of advice I ever got, which is way back in 1998, I think it was. I went to a writers conference at my local university where I was actually teaching, and I had hardly written anything. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to write, but I really have a clue. And there was this old school mystery writer there, and she had written dozens of books under her own name and a bunch more under her nom de plumes. And I wish I could remember her name, but I can't. But she said to the class, if you can write a page a day, by the end of the year, you'll have a book. And my first reaction was like, well, what if I write 2 pages a day? And I've done this in talks that I've had with people. I've teaching classes and that sort of thing. I tell this story and I say, okay, you're all going to write a page, either in your work in progress or start something new, whatever it is. Don't worry about it being perfect because you can always go back and edit. Just write. When you're done with your page, put your pens down or close your laptop. Everyone gets done within 15 minutes. I have never had somebody take more than 15 minutes,
Hmm.
unless they refuse to do the project, at which point I can't help them. As far as middle career writers or people a bit more established, have some articles out, maybe have a book or two out, I would say try to level up in every way that you can. Understand that this is a lifelong pursuit and you do have time to learn a lot, but don't put things off. Start going to conferences. I love the 20 books to 50K conferences that we have in Madrid and Sevilla. I live in Spain much of the time. Those are great to meet people. I was just saying how I've written more than 100 books. Well, you go there and suddenly you're surrounded by a bunch of people who've written more than you, which is pretty impressive. It's you don't get that every day, and you learn so much from that. Experiment with your style, experiment with your genre, try to push your word count up a little bit. Just keep pushing in every way, because your little incremental changes, improvements, and a little extra work every day, 15 years from now, that's going to be so much. That's going to add up to so much.
Hmm.
Where I am now as compared to where I was 10 years ago, incredible. And this is the same for all of my colleagues. COVID helped. My word count went through the roof.
I'm
So it's
sure.
like,
I'm sure.
yeah, this is
Okay. Sean, this has been great stuff. I mean,
yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
I have so much great material and so many different topics. So how can people find out more about you and your work?
Okay, well, I am on a lot of my books are on Kindle Unlimited and Amazon. I have a lot of my older backlist wide on every store, Kobo and Barnes and Noble and all that. It's Sean McLachlan, SeanMcLachlan. Instagram, and Facebook. My author pages are Writer Sean, RiiterSean. Sorry about that. And then I have SeanMcLachlan.net, which is my website, which desperately needs updating because I don't even have my Weimar series up there. So you probably noticed that, but we're kind enough not to mention it. So yeah, I
Okay.
do need to update my website.
Uh,
But then there's a newsletter that you can sign up to there, and you can get a couple of free books. And I have a monthly newsletter with travel articles, occasional short stories, and coupons and everything like that. And I'm gonna have one out this month, so a lot
oh,
of fun.
all right,
Yeah.
that is fantastic. Sean, thank you again so much for being here today. And it is SeanMcLachlan.net. And if you want this proper spelling, it is on the title card for this web for this episode.
Thank you
So
very much.
everybody, feel free to like and subscribe. Make sure you tell your friends. I can always use more followers. You can check out my screenwriting blog, Maximum Z, at MaximumZ.blog. I'm on Twitter because I'm not calling it the other thing at Maximum_Z. I'm on Instagram at Pez Screenwriting, PEZ, because those are my initials. And you can check out my Go Ahead and Ask books on Amazon, the ones about screenwriting and Pi, two very wonderful things. And feel free to follow this show's Twitter account at Podcast CWL, which of course stands for Creative Writing Life. Sean McLachlan, once again, thank you so much for being here today. This was just a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a blast.
No, my pleasure. Okay, everybody, thanks for listening and thanks for watching. Again, that's Sean. I'm Paul. This has been the Creative Writing Life podcast. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy. Most importantly, go write something.